Sri Lanka over the Easter break. We send our condolences to those families affected and to their communities as well. And coming so soon after the terrible events in Christchurch, New Zealand, just before Easter, it serves as a bleak reminder of how fragile our human rights and freedoms are, and how we must redouble our efforts in this place and outside to hold our communities together. I will.
I'm grateful. The whole House will be grateful for the way he's introduced this debate and for those sentiments. Would he agree with me that people do these things for publicity and public reaction, and we should take care to make sure that our publicity, our public reaction, confronts and confounds their aims, so that what they do will be in vain, even though it's had a terrible toll on those directly affected?
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right, and we should stand firm against terrorist atrocities wherever they are perpetrated, but we should stand strong as a community, both in the United Kingdom, but also a global community against such acts of terror, and we should call them out wherever they take place. Madam Deputy Speaker, turning to the motion and the debate in question, I welcome the opportunity to raise the important matter of local government funding during this Opposition Day debate, especially considering how scarce of an opportunity we have on this side of the House to raise matters in such debates. And I want to pay tribute to my honourable friend, the Shadow Leader of the House of Commons, whose dogged pursuit of this issue has allowed us to debate this important matter today. You see, whilst in this place our discussion has been dominated by Brexit, across the country, our local councils and our local services that people rely on are straining at the seams. Now, I want to pay tribute to councillors of all political persuasions and none for the work that they do in serving their communities, to the council officers and those dedicated public servants who deliver those neighbourhood and care services on the front line. Because years of uncertainty and unfair funding have created a quiet crisis that is now impossible to ignore. Because under this government, the facts speak for themselves. Local authorities have faced a reduction to core funding from this government of nearly £16 billion since 2010. That means that councils will have lost 60 pence out of every £1 that the last Labour government provided to spend on local services. Now, when the Prime Minister entered Downing Street, she promised to build a country that works for everyone. And then she promised an end to austerity. As her time in office probably comes to an end, we are able to reflect on both of these things. And like many areas of her leadership, I'm sure we will all find that in both these areas she has been sorely lacking. I will give way.
I'm very grateful, and he's making, as usual, a very clear statement of the situation local government finds itself in today. Can I just say to him, as one of the 10 councils that suffered the heaviest cut, and yet I represent a constituency in a city that is one of the most disadvantaged in this country, that it's clear that there were decisions being made about where those cuts should fall that meant that the poorest, the most vulnerable, have seen those cuts on their shoulders and not on the richest in society.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and she champions the cause of the communities of Kingston upon Hull, one of the most deprived local authorities in England, and yet one of the areas that has received the heaviest amount of cuts to their spending power since 2010. This was a political choice, and it is one that has decimated many of the communities, including the one she represents, across England. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Grateful to my honourable friend, and he is making a very powerful speech. I'm sure he will come further onto this argument, but does he also agree that the cuts in essential local government services inevitably, in many areas, lead to additional expenditure elsewhere? And I think particularly of the decimation of youth services and early years prevention, which have undoubtedly made a contribution to the extra stress and extreme youth violence that we are seeing on our streets.
My honourable friend's absolutely right. You know, we used to have something called Total Place, and that was all the public sector bodies working together in conjunction towards a single strategy for a local area. But what we've seen as a consequence of the austerity since 2010 is a complete breakdown of that collaborative working. But it's worse than that, because what has actually happened is that rather than public bodies working together collaboratively, pooling resources and getting the best possible levels of services for those communities, we've actually seen cost shunting. So for the sake of spending money on youth services, we are seeing a rise in crime, pushing the costs to the police. Because of the cuts to the police budgets, we are seeing the costs shunted onto other public bodies. That is not a common sense approach to dealing with people's needs, with people's services, for building stronger communities, or in fact for spending public money wisely. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank you for my honourable friend for giving way. And just this morning on the issue of cost shunting, we were hearing from representatives from families for children with special educational needs and disabilities who were talking about their needs not being met through the education budget, through the high needs block from local government or through the health needs budget, because each one is trying to get the other one to pay the bill. And what actually happens is that the child with special needs and disabilities falls through the gap and remains unsupported.
And my honourable friend is absolutely right, and there are too many instances across the public sector now where cost shunting is resulting in precisely what my honourable friend says: vulnerable people falling through gaps that should not exist. And I think, in their hearts of hearts, members opposite, who clearly deal with similar casework that we do, will know that that's happening in their areas too. So if the honourable gentleman is going to apologise for the cuts that he has forced on our local communities, I'll give way to him.
It's very kind of him. He was referring to what's happened since 2010. Let's just remind us that the Labour manifesto of 2010, it said there'd be certain areas that would be prioritised that it would protect. Will he remind us, did that include local government?
I'll remind the honourable gentleman that the Labour manifesto in 2017 said that we would put money back into our public services, something that he has single-handedly failed to do in the 3 years almost since that general election. I'll give way to my honourable friend first.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, who is making an incredibly pertinent speech this afternoon, but does he not agree it's completely perverse, the fact that public health budgets in York under the Tory Lib Dem Council have been slashed, whilst we're seeing the 10-year plan saying we've got to invest in public health?
It's precisely the short-sighted way that this government has approached funding local government, that it passed on public health budgets to local government, I think was a good move. It was one of the few things in the 2012 Lansley Act that I thought was good, because it took back to local councils precisely what local councils were invented to tackle, and that was to improve the health and well-being of the citizen. Of course, many councils started off their lives 150 or so years ago as local boards of health, and I think that having that focus on public health and on health and well-being is absolutely right. But you can't do it whilst you're cutting those budgets at the same time. And that's the scandal, that the areas that have seen the biggest cuts to their spending power, the areas that have seen the biggest cuts to the revenue support grant, the areas that have seen the biggest cuts to the public health grant, are the areas that need that resource the most. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm going to make a point that very neatly sums up what my honourable friend is talking about. In Chesterfield, we've had a reduction of 43.2%. I just took the time to have a look at the similar reduction in the minister's constituency. It's only 12%. So it's not like it's just a couple of percent different. It's 3.5 times more in my constituency.
And as my honourable friend will hear as I develop my argument, it's not just a one-off. It's happening across England, and it is unfair. And the Tories do not get that blatant unfairness because they have not seen the same levels of cuts in many of their areas that we have seen. And yet the impact that that has had on the communities we represent cannot be expressed loudly enough. And I will give way to my honourable friend who will express loudly the cuts to her area.
Let me take my honourable friend to Nottinghamshire, where spending on adult social care is now £33 million lower than under Labour. That is £71 lower per head, as need is increasing. Isn't it always the case under this government that vulnerable people are paying the price? Yeah.
But I will give way to him in a second, if I can answer my honourable friend first, because it's worse than that, because those are the headline figures. But what we actually know is that that local authority will have shifted money that was allocated to neighbourhood services to prop up the people-based services of adults and children's social care. So while social care has been cut in real terms, actually it would be far, far worse were it not for neighbourhood services in her area bailing out the gaps. I will give way to the honourable gentleman, then the right honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful that the honourable gentleman is being very generous, but he talks about unfairness. Does he not recognise that it was under the previous Labour government in which he served that the unfairness was introduced with the funding formula allocations, which shifted resources from local government in shire counties into metropolitan areas like he represents?
Proven he doesn't get the fairness argument.
You know, the honourable gentleman's made the case for me. The reason that let me dumb it down for him, and I don't wish to appear condescending, but it is a simple. It really is as simple as this. There has always been a recognition by governments of all colours that not every area has the same baseline. Some areas have greater need, and often those areas have less of an ability to raise income locally. So because of that, there has been a mechanism, a formula, whether it was the rate support grant that became the revenue support grant, to ensure that resources from the centre followed need. Now, what we have seen under his government is a 60% cut to the revenue support grant. 60 pence in every pound for the two councils in my constituency, Stockport and Tameside, is a lot of money. 60% cut to a very small revenue support grant that a number of members opposite their councils have only small revenue support grants, or no revenue support grants in some cases. 60% of nothing is nothing. And that's the unfairness. 60% cut to my area cannot be filled in by council tax rises. So it means rises in council tax for poorer services. Cuts are cuts. It's as simple as that. I'll give way.
I'm very grateful, and my area is one that got a really bad deal under past governments and is still getting a bad deal. And let me build a little bit of cross-party support here. I think it's obvious this government has to find more money for social care for future year budgets, and it needs to go to my area and to some areas represented opposite, and it needs to be done fairly. But what is Labour's current thinking on how much individuals and families should contribute? Because in social care, one of the big issues is how much of the family asset and income is at risk. Do they have any new thinking on that?
Yeah. Well, of course, it's individuals and families that are taking the hit from all the cuts and that they are having to step in. Look, we have to have... No, let me answer the right honourable gentleman first. We have to have a sensible discussion about how we are going to fund social care going forwards. Yes, it is about money, and we have pledged to ensure that there's £8 billion for social care. That was in Labour's manifesto in the 2017 general election. We need to make sure that that commitment remains in our future manifesto and is updated, because it needs that immediate cash injection to start with. But we also need to look very seriously about how we provide adult social care. And, you know, I really do wish that we could try and break down some of the politicking that has gone on for far too long. Well, members can heckle, but it is a fact that before the 2010 general election, Andy Burnham, the then Health Secretary, sat down with the Liberal Democrat health spokesperson and with the Conservative health spokesperson to try and work out a way forward. We went into that 2010 general election with poster boards about Labour's death tax. And that serves nobody. We need to make sure that we are going to have something that is sustainable for the long term, and I hope we can genuinely get to a place where we can do that and we can talk about how we fund adult social care and indeed children's services going forward. I will give way, and then I do need to make some progress.
I'm really grateful that my friend has mentioned children's services, because quite clearly the overspend on children's services has hit a new high of £800 million, and simply by £12 million in Newham alone last year. It's calculated that this funding gap is going to get to £2 billion by 2020. Isn't it a complete and utter nonsense and unsustainable for councils to be told that they should be using their reserves, Absolutely. What little reserves they still have, to keep safe our very vulnerable children?
My honourable friend's absolutely right, and you know, politics is a question of priorities, and I often remember the 2017 budget when the government put forward measures to cut the bank levy by £5 billion. We tabled an amendment to that budget proposing that £2 billion of that very same money should go to fully funding children's services, because precisely the cost shunting that I talked about earlier on in my contribution is what we see with children's services, and it's quite frankly scandalous that vulnerable children and families are not able to access the support that they need because of... I will give way to the right honourable gentleman, and then
I'm very grateful he's being generous. Again, in the spirit of cooperation across the chamber, he makes the point about adult social care. At whatever level it's funded, he has pointed out, and others have pointed out, the unfairnesses between different parts of the country because it's funded through local provision. Has he considered, or would he consider, actually going back to a system where the money is provided and distributed nationally rather than locally, so that this particular problem will be taken off the backs of local government?
Well, of course, I would be very happy to look at any suggestion. It's my honourable friend, the member for Worsley and Eccles, that leads on social care issues for the Labour front bench. But, of course, I think that the fundamental issue is the money has to come from somewhere, and some of that has to be centrally provided. And we've set out how some extra resources can be put forward for social care. I will give way later on, but I do want to make some progress, because the Prime Minister had said that austerity has ended. She said it in her conference speech last October. But instead of an end to austerity, in January we saw a local government finance settlement that once again cut even deeper into council budgets. Well, the Minister says it went up, but actually it confirmed what many of us feared, because under this government there will never be an end to the pain of austerity, nothing has changed, because the settlement, whilst it offered an increase in spending power next year for local government, let's bust the myth. This year's funding package came with a £1.3 billion extra cut from central government funding in the revenue support grant. So an uplift in spending power has been paid for by local people through increased council tax. That is not fiscal devolution. It is another attempt by this government to shift the burden onto local taxpayers and to devolve the blame for these decisions to councillors of all political persuasions, including councillors of the party opposite. The fact is, though, Madam Deputy Speaker, that areas like the one I represent, I'll give way in a second, cannot bring in anything like the resources through local council tax increases that are needed to meet the growing demand for social care and for our neighbourhood services. And it has left areas of the greatest need unable to mitigate for the cuts imposed by this government, and it's residents who end up paying more in council tax for the services to be stripped back further away. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady first.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. My honourable friend from Ludlow has made the point that whilst last Labour government were in power, they shifted money from the Shire counties to the metropolitan areas. He describes that as an increased area of need, but does he recognise that in rural areas such as Lincolnshire, where my constituency is, that services cost more to deliver because of the geography involved?
Yeah. The Honourable Lady has made the case that in rural areas there are greater costs to providing services. In some cases that is correct, but it's a minority of cases. And actually all the evidence, including in a report commissioned by the Secretary of State's Department, shows that actually the opposite is true. Now, I don't want to get into an argument with the Honourable Lady about how we cut up the cake. The cake is shrinking. We need to grow a bigger cake so we can genuinely share the slices out more fairly. But as we continue to shrink the cake, actually all it does is it pits her area against my area and her needs against the needs of the areas that I represent. And I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. Lewisham Council has had to propose a 2% precept to fund adult social care, to fund the widening gap, yet Lewisham is in the bottom 20% of most deprived boroughs. Does my honourable friend agree with me that what is needed is, rather than asking some of the poorest to pay more, is proper funding from central government for essential adult social care?
Yeah. My honourable friend is absolutely right. We need to grow that cake, but also the distribution of those resources has to follow the need. Because if we are serious about tackling health inequalities, if we genuinely want a fairer, more equal country, if we want to widen the life expectancy between the richest and the poorest, which sadly is narrowing, you don't do it by cutting resources and services from the areas that need it the most. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
The honourable gentleman is making a very powerful case. If you get on the train at Birmingham New Street, or get off then in Erdington, either Gravelly Hill or Erdington Station, and you're a man, you're likely to live 7 years less than if you continued on out into the leafy shires of Four Oaks. Birmingham City Council is the 6th most deprived in the whole of the country. It suffered the biggest cuts in local government history of nearly £700 million, with another £80 million to come. Does the honourable gentleman agree with me that what's been grotesque about the treatment of a great city like Birmingham is not just the scale of the cuts, including 12,000 staff gone from the City Council, but the grotesque unfairness compared with the treatment of some of the leafy shires Birmingham is high need, but is being treated as a low priority.
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. The treatment of that great city of Birmingham has been appalling. And the people of Birmingham deserve the resources that they need to have decent public services. And he has been a feisty champion of the needs of the people of his constituency and that great city, and will continue to make that case. Because I will give way to... Yes, because another great Birmingham MP.
I just wanted to follow up the point on Birmingham. If ever there was a city that's been subject to close government scrutiny, it's Birmingham. For 5 years, it's been subject to the government's improvement panel, so the Secretary of State knows inside out what the financial situation is in Birmingham. How does he justify forcing up the council tax in a city where 42% of the children are in poverty?
Yeah, absolutely, and I'll leave it to the Secretary of State to answer that, because I think that Birmingham has been dealt a bad set of cards by this government. But, you know, it's not just Birmingham. Researchers from Cambridge University have exposed the uneven impact of the government's funding of local government. They find that since 2010, changes in local authority spending power range from a drop of 46% to a fall of a mere 1.6%. And when we compare these reductions to the indices of deprivation, we see that more deprived areas have been forced to undergo bigger cuts in service spending, with smaller spending cuts in the least deprived areas. 9 of the 10 most deprived councils have seen cuts 3 times higher than the national average. This is backed up by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who also suggest that since 2016, the most well-off councils have actually seen an increase of 2.8% to their spending power, whilst the poorest areas have seen very little growth, despite facing the largest pressures on their services. I'll give way.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. Would he agree with me that the fact that 8 out of 10 councils receiving the largest cuts are Labour control, and yet 8 out of 10 receiving the lowest cuts are Conservative control, reinforces what we're trying to do on this Opposition Day debate?
Yeah. Absolutely, we have to highlight this unfairness, and we have to keep going on until this government wakes up, smells the coffee and understands the damage that they are doing to the fabric of so many communities in England through cutting our local neighbourhood services and depriving people-based services, adult social care and children's services of the resources they need. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I'd like to thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. Essex County Council is the second largest provider of children's services by head of population. And it's gone in 2010 from being a failed children's service to now being ranked outstanding by Ofsted, with less money going into the service, but because of a focus on early intervention and partnership working. Ofsted, outstanding. Does he agree with me that it's not just funding that makes a difference to our services, but it's also how the money is used?
Well, of course, the Honourable Lady... Well, the Minister says, how could I disagree with that? I disagree with the Honourable Lady because, for a start, the funding has increased in Essex on children's services, and she should perhaps check that up. But I have to say, look... Children, if she is saying that there isn't a crisis in children's services, then she is going against all the evidence that has been put forward by the Conservative-controlled Local Government Association. Perhaps she should speak to her own colleagues in local government. I will give way.
My neighbour from the North West region for giving way, and he's making an incredibly impassioned and very pertinent speech. Would he join me in praising Labour-run St Helens Council for protecting services through an integrated St Helens Cures model and the creation of a People's Board? But would he also agree that even an innovative council that puts its residents first cannot possibly mitigate the 71% of cuts to its funding since 2010? It is simply not sustainable.
He's absolutely right. And, you know, I pay tribute to those Labour councillors like the ones in his constituency that are making incredibly difficult decisions. They are the last line of defence for many of our communities, and they are doing what they can, but with both hands tied behind their backs by this government that just does not understand the basic economics of the areas that we represent. I'll give way in a short while. I want to move on to the issue of social care briefly before making concluding remarks. The largest of these pressures remains adult and children's social care. According to the LGA, adult social care services face a £1.5 billion funding gap next year and needs £2 billion for children's services. But with the Cabinet too interested in the internal machinations and the absence of any leadership from the Prime Minister, we're yet to see the promised social care green paper. In fact, this year's April Fool revealed himself to be the Health Secretary after he missed his own new deadline of the 1st of April for the social care green paper. But no one was laughing, because this was the 5th missed deadline. Following the summer of 2017, the end of 2017, the summer of 2018, autumn 2018, and the 1st of April. Despite these delays, it seems that little progress has been made. And yet there is so much concern in the sector that last month, 15 key organisations, including the LGA, the Society of Local Authority Chief Executives and Senior Managers, and NHS organisations and charities, were forced to write to the government concerned that Brexit was becoming a distraction from any action on the real crisis that is happening to the services that people rely on. I will give way to the Chair of the...
Give way. And, you know, clearly there are differences in the cuts between different authorities. But there is a collective view in local government about the crisis in social care. And when Councillor Paul Carter, the chair of the County Councils Network, leader of Kent Council, came to give evidence to us on our last inquiry into adult social care, he simply said we are approaching a cliff edge. And it may be that there aren't councils immediately going to follow Northamptonshire over the cliff edge, but it won't be long before they do, unless there's a fundamental change to the funding of social care in this country.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I say to the Secretary of State, if he won't listen to the chair of this Select Committee, listen to the leaders of your own councils who are saying precisely what my honourable friend has said. There is a cliff edge, and nothing that this government has so far done has done anything to remove that cliff edge. It might have pulled a few councils back a few years before they topple over. But unless we fundamentally change the approach of this government towards our social care services, we are not going to be able to solve the crisis in local government. Now, in concluding, Madam Deputy Speaker, what we have seen is, for the first time in England, a standard £2,000 council tax bill introduced by a Conservative council. We've also seen the cost of failure from this Tory government, because Tory Northamptonshire has been pushed onto local people after the Secretary of State permitted the council to raise council tax above normal limits as it grapples with bankruptcy. Local people are paying the price for Tory mismanagement. This is what happens when the Tories don't fund local government and are in charge of the town hall. Austerity is not over. But across the country, Labour councillors and Labour councils are showing that it does not have to be this way. Under the shadow of this government, Labour councillors are innovating. They're standing up to austerity. They're protecting local services. They are the torchbearers for the new politics that we will see with the next Labour government. And on the 2nd of May, there is a clear choice. Continued austerity with the Tories, or proper investment, fairness and a real change with Labour councils making a real difference to the communities that they represent. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, we need a Labour government too, because we need a government that is committed to funding children's services, to funding adult services, to funding neighbourhood services, to rebuilding our communities from the grassroots up, to putting pride back into civic professions, to encouraging our communities to grow and prosper. We will rebuild this country for the many and not the few. I commend this motion to the House.
The question is, and as on the order paper, Secretary of State James Brokenshire.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I